Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something really interesting, wildlife conservation in South Africa.
Okay.
It's this place that's just teeming with incredible animals
Mm-hmm.
and plants, but it's also facing some pretty tough challenges.
Right.
And we've got a whole bunch of stuff to look at today. News articles, YouTube videos, even some research papers,
Wow.
and stuff from actual conservation websites. So we're going to try to get to the bottom of all this stuff. What's really going on beyond just the headlines and the safari pictures you see on Instagram. What do you think?
Well, I think what makes South African conservation so interesting is that it's a bit of a paradox. You've got Kruger National Park,
Yeah.
which is like, the poster child for conservation success. But then you have other places like Madikwe Game Reserve
Yeah.
that are struggling with like overpopulation and mismanagement. It kind of makes you wonder, can conservation efforts actually backfire?
Yeah, I mean, that's a scary thought. Like you're trying to do good,
Right.
but you end up making things worse. Exactly.
So to get a better understanding of all of this, maybe we should rewind a bit. I mean, we've got some sources here that mention how private game reserves are having a big impact.
Yeah.
But before we get into all of that, how did South Africa even get to this point? Like, where did this whole conservation journey begin? What do you think?
Well, South Africa's approach to conservation, it's not like a new thing.
Right.
It's been shaped by like a whole mix of stuff,
Yeah.
indigenous knowledge, colonial influence, and even the impact of apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
All these different eras have kind of left their mark on how they view wildlife and manage it.
Okay, so you're saying it's like layers upon layers of history
Exactly.
that have built up over time. Okay, so let's start with the bottom layer, the indigenous communities.
Yeah.
We have a source here from the South African Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment.
Okay.
And they talk about how these communities lived in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
They had sustainable practices.
They even had taboos against killing certain animals. Like
Yeah.
it was built into their culture.
It's really fascinating. I mean, imagine a system where respect for nature was just woven into like the fabric of society.
Right.
Resource management was localized, and their spiritual beliefs kind of dictated which species were off limits.
Mm-hmm.
It was like conservation as a way of life,
Yeah.
almost like an unwritten agreement with the land.
Wow, that's beautiful. I mean, that's a completely different way of looking at it than what we're used to.
Right.
Okay, so then colonialism happens. I'm guessing things changed drastically.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Okay.
When Europeans arrived, it brought a huge shift in mindset.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, wildlife became this resource that could be exploited for profit.
I see. So it became less about respecting nature
Yeah,
and more about, how can we make money off of this?
exactly.
And we see that reflected in some of our sources from like the mid-19th century, where overhunting and deforestation became massive problems. So there was a growing need for conservation. But some sources also mention that this led to the creation of game reserves,
Right.
which sometimes meant that communities were displaced from their land. So it seems like these early conservation efforts weren't always benefiting everyone.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. Conservation can't just be about protecting animals. You have to consider the people, too.
Yeah.
When you force communities off their land, it creates resentment and mistrust, and that just makes it way harder to achieve any kind of long-term conservation goals.
That makes total sense. And then, of course, you have the apartheid era, which I imagine just deepened those divisions even further.
Absolutely.
So how did things change after apartheid ended? Did that bring any changes to the approach to conservation?
Yeah, definitely. After apartheid, there was this big push to bridge the gap between communities and conservation areas. And one key moment in all of this was the Keep Vital Memorandum, which really promoted this idea of people in parks.
I've heard of that. So our sources explain it as a way to balance conservation goals with community benefits. Like everyone needs to feel like they have a stake in the game.
Exactly. Everyone wins.
So it sounds like things were finally moving in a more inclusive direction.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like a turning point. But apartheid also had this unintended consequence that's actually become one of South Africa's strengths.
Okay, now I'm curious. What's that?
Private wildlife ownership.
Wait, what? How did that happen?
Well, initially it was driven by economic factors, but it's had this huge impact on wildlife populations. We were looking at this article from the African Insight Academy, and they were describing how private reserves have fueled this booming wildlife economy
Wow.
because they embrace these sustainable use practices.
So you're saying that in South Africa, owning wildlife can actually help to conserve it.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, right?
It does.
But unlike a lot of other African countries, South Africa really recognizes that well-managed private ownership can be a powerful force for good.
Right.
Like, look at the white rhino.
Okay.
They were once on the brink of extinction, but they've made this amazing comeback.
Wow.
And it's thanks in part to these private reserves.
So it's like this win-win situation.
Right.
Wildlife thrives, communities benefit, and conservation efforts become self-sustaining.
Exactly. But even with all these successes, South Africa's conservation journey hasn't been without its bumps in the road.
Right.
Our sources also reveal some pretty unsettling situations, like what's happening at the Madikwe Game Reserve.
Yeah, those stories about elephants dying from starvation and dehydration, they're just heartbreaking.
It's awful.
It really shows that even with the best intentions, things can go wrong if there's mismanagement.
Yeah, it highlights this really important point. Good intentions just aren't enough.
Right.
You need constant vigilance, the ability to adapt, and a willingness to learn from mistakes.
Right.
Otherwise, even these protected areas, they can become these tragic examples of how conservation efforts can backfire.
Yeah. Okay, so we've seen the good, the bad, the successes, the failures. It seems like South African conservation is this constant balancing act.
It is.
Between all these competing interests, and the strategies are constantly evolving. But what about the ethics of all of this?
Oh, yeah, that's where things get even more complicated. Our sources expose some of the darker sides of wildlife tourism.
Okay.
Specifically, the exploitation of animals for profit. Remember that YouTube video from Matador Network, The Ugly Truth About South African Wildlife?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was eye-opening for sure.
That was rough.
You mean the one that exposes the link between cub petting and can hunting?
Yes.
That was pretty disturbing. Like, you think you're doing something innocent. You're petting a cute little cub.
Right.
But you don't realize you're actually fueling this cruel and unethical industry.
That's terrible. And it raises this big question, right?
Yeah.
Where do you draw the line between responsible tourism and exploitation? As travelers, we need to be aware of the potential harm we can cause.
Absolutely. And with social media, it's easier than ever to spread misinformation or even unintentionally help poachers.
Right.
It's a good reminder that we all have a responsibility to be informed and really think critically about what we're consuming and sharing online.
For sure. Speaking of being informed, do you remember that news about the rhino bond?
Oh, yeah.
That seemed like a pretty radical approach to conservation finance.
Yeah, the press release from the World Bank about the wildlife conservation bond.
Yes.
It's like investors are actually betting on the success of rhino conservation efforts.
Right.
And if the rhino population grows, they get a payout.
Exactly. It's pretty revolutionary.
Yeah.
Imagine if conservation became a profitable venture. I mean, it could attract all these new investors
Right.
who are driven by, both financial gain and a desire to make a difference.
That's a really cool thought. Okay, before we get too deep into that, there's another controversy that I think we need to unpack.
Yeah.
Captive lion breeding.
Ah, yeah. That's a tough one.
Right.
We've got sources from both sides of the argument, and they paint very different pictures. On one hand, you have organizations like Wildlife Ranching South Africa, and they're arguing that closing down the lion industry would be disastrous.
They believe that ethical breeders play a crucial role in preserving lion genetics.
Yeah.
And they say that shutting down the industry would lead to job losses and a decline in the lion population.
Right, and they even point to that situation in Madikwe as evidence that the government isn't doing a good job of managing those wild lion populations.
Which is interesting.
It is.
Because on the other hand, we have that Matador Network video and some other sources that argue that captive breeding actually undermines those wild lion populations.
Yeah.
Because it fuels unethical practices like can hunting.
That's a real dilemma. It's like this ethical and ecological minefield, There are no easy answers. It's not as simple as just saying captive breeding is bad or sustainable use is good. There are valid points on both sides.
So it's more nuanced than it appears on the surface.
Way more nuanced.
Okay, so what's your take on all of this so far? What's standing out to you the most?
To be honest, I'm having a little trouble wrapping my head around all these competing interests.
Yeah.
It seems if everyone agrees that conservation is important, but the how is where things get tricky.
You've put your finger on it. There's no magic solution. And that's what makes South African conservation so intriguing.
Right.
It really forces you to grapple with these complex issues,
Yeah.
and think critically about the compromises that have to be made.
Speaking of tough choices, one thing that stood out to me was that argument from Wildlife Ranching South Africa about the government's role in all of this.
Right.
They claim that the government isn't doing enough to manage those wild lion populations, and they even brought up that situation at Medikwe as proof.
Yeah, and that ties into their whole stance on sustainable use.
Right. They believe that private ranches, with their controlled hunting programs and breeding programs, are actually doing a better job of conserving some species than the government.
That's a pretty controversial claim.
It is.
But it does make you wonder, what if private landowners actually have a financial incentive to protect wildlife?
Right.
Could that be more effective than just relying on those government-managed reserves?
It's a debate that's been going on for a long time, and there are strong opinions on both sides.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure, South African conservation is always changing, and the strategies that might have worked in the past might not be the best solutions for the future.
Okay, speaking of the future, I was reading this article from the University of Pretoria,
Okay.
and they talk about the challenges facing wildlife conservation down the line. And it's not just poaching and habitat loss that they're worried about.
You're right. Climate change is a huge factor, as is human-wildlife conflict. As human populations grow and expand into wild areas, the chances of running into animals increase, especially large predators like lions.
But that same article also mentioned a study about this serval population that's actually thriving in this industrialized area.
Oh, yeah.
Which kind of gives you hope that even in a world dominated by humans, wildlife can adapt and survive if we just give them a chance.
It's a good point. It really speaks to the resilience of nature.
Yeah.
But it also underscores the importance of research.
Yeah.
The more we know about how wildlife behaves, how populations change, and how we as humans impact all of that, the better equipped we'll be to come up with solutions.
Right.
Ones that allow both humans and animals to share this planet.
And that's where organizations like the Center for Wildlife Management at the University of Pretoria are playing such an important role.
Absolutely.
They're doing all this cool research on everything from rehabilitating elephants to the effect of off-road vehicles on ecosystems.
That's right. Their work is crucial for figuring out the best strategies and policies for conservation. Like, for example, their research on elephant rehabilitation.
Yeah.
It's helping to ensure the survival of captive elephants that can't be released back into the wild.
That's amazing. So they're giving those elephants a second chance at a decent life,
Yeah.
even if it's not in their natural habitat.
Exactly. And the work they're doing on the impact of human activities is helping us figure out how to minimize the damage we're doing and develop more sustainable practices.
It sounds like there's still a lot of hope for South African conservation,
I think so.
but it's also clear that it's going to require a lot of collaboration, a lot of innovation, and a willingness to adapt to a changing world.
I agree. And it's not just on the scientists and researchers.
Right.
Everyone needs to be involved. From tourists making ethical travel choices to policymakers creating laws that actually protect wildlife and their habitats.
Speaking of ethical travel,
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier how private game reserves are having this big impact.
Mm-hmm.
We found this story about a reserve in one of the sources where they're reintroducing southern white rhinos, which were almost extinct.
Yes. That YouTube video from the Context channel,
Yeah.
it was so inspiring. I mean, imagine 180 farmers coming together like a decade ago to rewild their land
Wow.
and creating this model that benefits both the environment and their communities.
And they've created 800 permanent jobs.
It's incredible.
It proves that conservation and economic development can really go hand in hand.
It's a powerful example of what can happen when local communities are empowered to become the stewards of their own natural heritage.
Right.
And it's a model that could work in other parts of the world, too, showing that conservation can create a better future for everyone.
You know, hearing all these success stories, it makes me wonder,
That's that.
what would I do if I were in charge of managing a conservation area in South Africa?
That's a fantastic question.
Right.
It's something we should all be thinking about. Would you prioritize community involvement? Would you focus on attracting investors through programs like the Rhino Bond? Would you embrace sustainable use?
Right.
I mean, it seems like finding the right balance between all these different approaches is really the key.
You're absolutely right. There are no simple solutions, and the best approach probably involves a blend of strategies that are tailored to the specific needs of each area.
For sure. But one thing is clear.
What's that?
Doing nothing is not an option. The future of South African wildlife depends on us being informed, engaged, and willing to think outside the box.
And it's not just about South Africa, is it?
No, not at all.
The lessons we learn from their conservation efforts can be applied to other places around the world that are dealing with similar problems.
Absolutely. We're all connected. The choices we make as individuals and as a global community, they have a ripple effect that impacts the entire planet.
Okay, so let's say I'm inspired.
Okay.
I'm ready to do something.
Yeah.
What can I do to make a real difference in wildlife conservation, even if I'm not in South Africa?
Well, you can start by being a more informed consumer,
Okay.
support businesses that are actually committed to sustainable practices, and stay away from products that contribute to destroying habitats or exploiting wildlife.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what about those of us who want to do more than just shop responsibly?
Right.
Are there ways to get more involved, more hands-on?
Of course. You can volunteer with conservation organizations. You can donate to wildlife charities.
Uh-huh.
You could even contact your elected officials and advocate for policies that protect wild spaces.
So there are a lot of options out there.
Lots of ways to make a difference, even from afar.
Okay, so we've talked about the struggles, the victories, the different ways to approach conservation.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to something you brought up earlier.
Okay.
The rhino bond.
Yeah.
You said it could really revolutionize how we finance conservation.
It could.
Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Sure. So the Rhino Bond is a really interesting example of what's called impact investing, which is basically where investors put their money into projects that are designed to achieve certain social or environmental goals. And in this case, the goal is to grow the black rhino population in South Africa.
So instead of just donating to a charity, investors are buying bonds that are directly tied to how well the rhino conservation efforts are doing.
Exactly.
That's pretty innovative.
It's a cool idea. And what's really exciting is that if they actually meet those conservation goals, the investors get a payout at the end of the bond's term.
Oh, wow.
So it's like you're getting a financial return for investing in a healthier planet.
It's like making money by doing good.
Pretty much. And it has the potential to bring in a lot of new investors who may not have thought about supporting conservation before.
I can definitely see how that could change the game when it comes to funding for conservation. But are there any risks?
I mean, sure, there are always risks with any investment.
Right.
But the potential benefits of something like the rhino bonds are huge.
Yeah.
Not only could it provide crucial funding for rhino conservation, but it could also pave the way for similar financial tools that could support conservation efforts all over the world.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
It feels like we're on the verge of a new era of conservation, one where protecting nature isn't just the right thing to do, but also a smart financial move.
I agree. And it reminds us that conservation isn't just about saving animals for their own sake.
Right.
It's about making sure we have a healthy and sustainable future for everyone.
Well, this deep dive has been quite the journey.
It has.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the historical roots of conservation to the ethical challenges and these new financial solutions. It's clear that South African wildlife conservation is this complex issue with no simple answers.
Yeah, it's multifaceted, but that's also what makes it so fascinating, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
It pushes us to think critically, to challenge our assumptions, and to really engage in meaningful conversations about the relationship between humans and nature.
And it's been so inspiring to see the passion and the dedication of all the people who are on the front lines of conservation,
Right.
fighting to protect these incredible animals in the places they live.
It gives you hope. It's a reminder that even in the face of these enormous challenges, there's always hope. And each of us can do our part to create a future where both people and wildlife can flourish.
And speaking of doing our part, before we get to our final thoughts, we want to hear from you, the listeners. What has been the most surprising or thought-provoking thing you've learned from this deep dive?
Right. What's resonated with you the most?
I think for me, it's just how complex it all is. It's not just about saving animals. It's about understanding the history, the economics, the ethics, and the role of communities.
Right. It's about finding solutions that actually work for everyone.
Which is a lot harder than it sounds.
It is. You hit the nail on the head. The South African conservation is like this giant web where everything's connected.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to keep learning and keep asking questions and to keep having these conversations.
Absolutely. And, we've covered a lot in this deep dive, but we've really only scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
Right. There are so many challenges facing all these different species. And the debate over sustainable use and the role of those private game reserves, that's still ongoing.
And that's the beauty of it. This deep dive is just the beginning.
Right.
It's like a jumping off point.
Yeah.
What are you most curious about? What threads do you want to follow?
Right? Maybe you're fascinated by the rhino bond
Yeah.
and you want to learn more about impact investing. Or maybe you're really intrigued by those servals that are thriving in that industrial area.
Yeah.
And you want to know more about how humans and wildlife can coexist.
Exactly. So whatever it is, don't stop learning here. Check out those research papers, explore the websites of those organizations we mentioned, connect with other people who are passionate about this stuff.
One thing that's become really clear to me is that there's no right answer when it comes to South African conservation. It's all about navigating trade-offs, considering different viewpoints, and finding solutions that work for the long haul.
It's about being a critical thinker. You can't just accept the easy answers. You have to challenge assumptions, question the narratives, and be okay with things being complicated.
And it's that complexity that makes it so fascinating.
It does.
It's not black and white. There are so many shades of gray, and that's what keeps the conversation going.
Right, and it's a conversation that we need to keep having. The future of South African wildlife, and really the future of our planet, depends on it. It depends on us being willing to engage with these issues and do something about them.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought. Imagine you're not just a listener. You're actually a decision maker.
Okay.
Someone who has the power to shape the future of conservation. What kind of legacy would you want to leave behind?
It's a good question. Would you go for those short-term gains, or would you prioritize long-term sustainability? Would you focus on saving specific animals, or would you try to protect entire ecosystems? Would you try out those new financial tools, or would you stick with the traditional approaches?
Those are tough questions.
Yeah, they are.
But they're questions we need to be asking ourselves. Because the choices we make today will affect the natural world for generations to come.
And those choices start with each of us. It's about being informed, getting involved, and being willing to make a difference.
So as you go about your day, think about the little things you can do to support conservation.
Yeah.
Like maybe reducing your carbon footprint, making sustainable choices when you shop,
Mm-hmm.
or supporting organizations that are working to protect the amazing diversity of life on our planet.
Every action, no matter how small, makes a difference.
It really does. And together, we can create a future where both people and wildlife can thrive.
I believe that.
That's it for our deep dive on South African wildlife conservation. We hope you learned something new, maybe felt inspired, and even got a little challenged along the way.
And remember, this is just the start. Keep learning. Keep asking questions. Keep the conversation alive. It matters.
Until next time, stay curious.